So as I mentioned at the end of the last video, this is a bonus topic. It's not officially part of Math 095. It's not something that you have to know about for this class anyway. Depending on what class you take next, you might have to know about it there. But it's sort of presented here as a bonus. So you don't have to watch this video if you don't want to, but if you want to see what this looks like, here we go. The way this method works is we transform an equation like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 into the kind of pattern that we were dealing with in the last video, where you got something squared equal to some number, and then once you have it set up like that, we know how to deal with that. You just say, okay, then the something equals plus or minus the square root of that number. So completing the square is the process of getting something into that form in the first place. And it's based on the fact that if you take a binomial, one thing either plus or minus something else, and you square the whole thing, what you end up with is something that starts with the first thing squared, it ends with the second thing squared, and in the middle it has 2 times the first thing times the second thing. So if you were going the other direction in factoring, if you had something that had a perfect square at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle, it had 2 times those things multiplied together, that would be factorable as just the first thing plus or minus the second thing, and then the whole thing is squared. So for example, x squared plus 10x plus 25 is equal to x plus 5 squared. That is, it's equal to x plus 5 times another x plus 5 if you multiply it out. And x squared minus 18x plus 81 is equal to x minus 9 squared. We did talk about this way back in the chapter on factoring. And notice the pattern here and the relationship among the various parts. Look at the 10 in front of the x. If you took half of that, that would be the 5 that's over here. And then if you square that, that would be the 25 that's right here. So if the number we started with was a 10 here, we could get these other numbers by taking half of the 10 and squaring it. Same thing with the second example. The number in front of the x is a minus 18. If you took half of that, that would be the minus 9 here. And then if you square that, that would be plus 81. So if you just knew the negative 18 in front of the x, half of that is the minus 9 that goes here, squared is the plus 81 that goes here. So now you try some. If we have x squared plus 12x plus blank equals something squared, what goes in the blanks? Remember, look at the number in front of the x, take half of that number and square it. So half of 12 would be 6, squared would be 36. And then what goes over here is an x plus a 6. That was what we had to square to get this. So this x squared plus 12x plus 36 is equal to this x plus 6 squared. Another example, y squared minus 20y plus, what goes in this blank? Remember, you have to look at the number in front of the variable, take half of that number, and square it. So when you do that, what do you get? Half of minus 20 is minus 10, but when you square it, it becomes plus 100. And then what goes here? The variable that's being squared here is y. The number that's being squared here is 10. It was minus because there's a minus here. So this is x minus 10 squared. So that's the key to this completing the square method of solving quadratic equations. So let's say we want to use that on the equation x squared minus 4x minus 21 equals 0. The first thing we do is we leave the x squared minus 4x where it is, but we get rid of the minus 21 on this side by just adding 21 to both sides. That turns it into x squared minus 4x equals positive 21. Now we're going to do what we were just talking about. We're going to complete the square. We're going to add a number to the end of the x squared minus 4x. And the number we're going to add is, well, look at what's in front of the x, take half of that and square it. Half of a minus 4 would be minus 2, squared would be 4. So add 4, and with an equation, you got to add the same thing to both sides. So I'm adding 4 to both sides of this equation. So what that gives me is, over here we have x squared minus 4x plus 4, which is x minus 2 squared. And on the other side, the 21 plus 4 is 25. So now we're back to the kind of situation we were talking about in the last video. X minus 2 squared equals 25. Something squared equals a number. So the something, the x minus 2, equals plus or minus the square root of the number. And here the square root of 25 would be 5. So that means x minus 2 equals 5, or x minus 2 equals negative 5. And then finish solving for x by adding 2 to both sides. X equals 7, or x equals negative 3. Now we could have solved this by factoring. This can be factored. You can solve it that way, and you would have gotten the same answers, 7 and negative 3. Now here's one that can't be done by factoring. If you try to factor x squared minus 10x plus 19, you'll find that that's not factorable. But we can still solve it by completing the square. So leave the two terms that involve x where they are, but get the constant term on the other side. So subtract 19 on both sides so that we have x squared minus 10x equals negative 19. Now, what do we have to add on? What number goes here that makes this a perfect square? Remember, the trick is to look at the number in front of the x, take half of that, and square it. So half of the minus 10 would be a minus 5, squared would be a plus 25. So we're adding 25 to both sides of the equation. Then x squared minus 10x plus 25 is x minus 5 squared, and negative 19 plus 25 is 6. So now we're down to something squared equals a number. X minus 5 squared equals 6. So that means x minus 5 itself equals plus or minus the square root of 6. And then adding 5 to both sides, x equals 5 plus the square root of 6, or if this was a minus square root of 6 and then we add 5 to both, we'd get x equals 5 minus the square root of 6. If you want exact solutions, that's as far as you could go. That would be your final answer. The two solutions to this equation are 5 plus the square root of 6 or 5 minus the square root of 6. And if you wanted to write it just as 5 plus or minus the square root of 6, you can write it that way. If you want decimal approximations, you could put this into your calculator and it would come out as approximately 7.45 and 2.55. So that's how completing the square works.